I'm Melody DeMar. I'm chair of the art committee here at the Rainier Club, and I'm sitting with Dr. Robert Winquist, an orthopedic surgeon who has an incredible interest in Edward S. Curtis. And I have to ask you, Bob, how did you get started collecting Curtis?
We moved in 1975 to our first house, and my wife and I had a wonderful elderly lady next door, and she had this Curtis picture, which we'll see later, and it was called The Vanishing Race. And it was a gold tone, which he considered his absolute best, where he printed on glass with gold and oil emulsion behind it. And this excited us so much that my wife purchased one for me for Christmas.
Oh.
And we've been excited about Curtis ever since.
Oh, how wonderful. Well, can you tell us a little bit about Curtis in your perspective?
Well, again, we started collecting then, and we've been collecting ever since. So we've been collecting for 35 or 40 years, and I still learn something about him every day. The amount of, not just the amount of work that he's done, but what magnificent and what variety he's done is just tremendous.
Even the collection here at the club is quite varied, and you only collect the gold tone series. How many of those do you have?
Well, we collect gold tones, and we have about 65.
My goodness.
But we also collect other Curtis prints as well. We just don't collect as many of them.
I see. Can you give us a brief history of Curtis and his relationship with the Rainier Club?
His relationship with the club, he was a superstar, which we'll learn, in the city of Seattle. So he was a portrait photographer, known by everyone in Seattle and taking great portraitures. And he then came to the club, was an early member of the club, and was taking portraits of the club's presidents and families, and those later became the mug shots. So they're hanging on the walls here at the Rainier Club.
Very interesting. Can you give us a brief history of Curtis and how he developed into this photographer?
It's just amazing. So he was born in 1868. His father was just 3 years after the Civil War, so he was a Civil War veteran who was struggling after the war, as many veterans have for lots of wars, and had trouble making it. And at age 5, they moved to Minnesota, where his father worked as an itinerant preacher, and he would go from town to town, and Curtis would travel with him by canoe, by land, by horse. They would live outside, they would camp, they would have to find their food. So as a very young child, Curtis learned to live in the outdoors, which was extremely important for him later. It's really what allowed him to do this later project with the Indians. And then at age 12, his father somehow or other had a camera lens from the Civil War. He'd picked it up during the Civil War. And Curtis made a box that went with this lens, and he started taking photos. And that's how he became interested in photography. And life still didn't go too well for the family. At age 14, Curtis was doing a lot to support the family. And at age 19, because they weren't making it, they moved out here to the Northwest. So they moved to near Port Orchard, where they built a log cabin, lived off the land. Curtis learned to dig mussels and dig clams and build a cabin. The family moved out, and 3 days after they arrived, the father died. So his father's died, and he's now supposed to take care of the entire family that just arrived. And he's working all day to try to make some money. He's in the evening tending a garden, digging clams, getting fish to feed the family. And at age 22, he falls in a lumber yard, breaks his back.
Oh my.
And now is stuck in bed for an entire year to recover from this terrible injury. And while in bed, two important things happened. So one, each day he learned to look at the light coming through the windows, and he became very interested in lighting and what effect lighting had. The second thing that happened is the 16-year-old neighbor girl came over and helped nurse him back to health, and later they ended up getting married.
Oh.
So he decided he couldn't do any of this hard labor anymore. That was over. and he was going to move to Seattle. So he borrowed $150 on the farm, moved to Seattle, and joined a photographic studio in 1901. So we have the turn of the century now. So we have Washington becoming a state in 1889. We have the Great Seattle Fire in 1889. And we now have him moving here right after that to start his work as a photographer doing portrait photography. And it just took off.
Now, Bob, we've been talking for a while about Curtis. Can you tell us what this picture of Curtis is about and the history of it?
I always call it the Brad Pitt picture. I think Brad Pitt saw this picture, and that's how he decided he wanted to look. But this is a superstar. He only had a 6th grade education in a one-room schoolhouse, so it's hard to know how much education he had. But despite that, he had incredible confidence. He had obviously great skills, and this is taken in 1899 at age 31. So he's only 31 years old and already a superstar in Seattle, and just doing fantastically well. So here he is at his best. He has his signature goatee and always the hat tilted to the side, which future pictures have that as well. He was a little bald and I think didn't want to show that, so he always is in a hat. But here he is, ready to go to take on the entire world, which he did.
Amazing.
We're now looking at this picture, which is extremely significant. So we just learned that Curtis is this bigger-than-life, wealthy, well-known businessman in Seattle who now gets sidetracked. And while living in Seattle, he would frequently see this woman up and down the streets, and it turned out it was Chief Seattle's daughter, Princess Angeline. So at that time, the Indians had all been forced off to reservation, and she refused to leave. She said, "This is my city, it's named after my father, and I'm not leaving." And Curtis became very attracted to that and very interested in that. So he took 3 pictures of her, and this is one. This is Princess Angeline as a clam digger. So one of her better known pictures is of her face, but this is what Curtis really wanted, is the Native Americans doing what they do. And here she is out digging clams on Puget Sound with her boat behind, and he became so infatuated with the Indians because of Princess Angeline that we'll see that takes over his life and dominates his life. So Princess Angeline was an important figure who now took this man away from his portrait photography and started channeling him in a different direction.
You know, I was just thinking, Bob, while you were talking, you had mentioned that Curtis was an outdoorsman. What other kind of activities did he do that got him out in the Northwest exploring this area?
When he arrived with his father over by Port Orchard, he would look each day at Mount Rainier, which was just a fascination to him. And once he got to his studio in Seattle, he then was also a climber of Mount Rainier and took photos at Mount Rainier, and he would go down there frequently. I don't know how he worked that into his schedule exactly, but he would go down there frequently climbing on Mount Rainier. And he took some famous photos of Mount Rainier. And then the Mazamas, a well-known climbing group that formed in Portland before the Mountaineers in Seattle, they wanted to send the biggest group ever to climb Mount Rainier. And they knew of him, and they asked him if he would lead the climb. And they were particularly proud because it's the most women that have ever climbed Mount Rainier together in their long skirts and their alpenstocks.
Oh my gosh.
And so he knew Mount Rainier really well, and he spent a tremendous amount of time up there, which, along with his camping with his father, became a very important part of his life.
Bob, I was wondering, how did Curtis come to meet so many famous people, important people of his time?
Here's a fellow with a 6th grade education that's obviously pulling it off in Seattle, so he must have a lot of charisma. And it takes back to Mount Rainier. So he was up on Mount Rainier one day, and Mount Rainier frequently will cloud in about halfway up. So the clouds will move in out of the mountain about halfway up the mountain. It'll still be clear on top, and he heard voices in the mist. And he then went calling back and forth to the voices. And when he found them, they were lost. They were near the Nisqually Glacier, which is deadly with huge crevasses, and he basically saved them. And these weren't just your average people. These were Bird Grinnell, the head of the Audubon Society, Clint Merriam, the head of National Geographic, and Gifford Pinchot, head of Forestry. And they were there at the request of Teddy Roosevelt, and they were there to decide if Mount Rainier should become a national park. And this was in 1898, and in fact, the next year, it was made the 5th national park in the nation. So what does he do? Does he take them down the mountain? No, he takes them up the mountain. So he takes them up to his camp at Camp Muir, cooks them dinner. He already had wood up there, shows them around Mount Rainier, brings them down to Seattle, takes them to his studio, and shows them around the studio and gets to know these people, important people, really, really well, which then led to the next year of being invited on the Harriman expedition as their photographers. So this was a huge group going to Alaska of scientists, many of them from the Smithsonian Institute, and going to Alaska to record things. These are anthropologists, these are paleontologists, these are, the biologists, all the famous people. And Harriman, who did all the railroads, he's funding the whole thing. And Curtis is the photographer, which once again, he gets interested in photographing Indians up there. The following year, this is what really did it for Curtis. Bird Grinnell. Bird Grinnell, again, was the fellow he rescued on Mount Rainier, head of the Audubon Society. He wasn't named Bird because of the Audubon Society. He had worked 20 years with the Plains Indians, and he would go there every summer to live with them, to learn about them. And they called him Bird because he would disappear every winter like the birds. So Bird Grinnell took him to the plains to stay with him for the summer and learn more about these Indians. And Curtis saw the Sundance ceremony and just was taken by it completely. And then went to the Hopi and to the Navajo, and he then came up with this dream of doing all of these volumes and capturing the Indians at their best. His goal was to capture them at their best, to save all of these people, their images, their language, their religions, everything, and he decided that that was his calling. So he came back and started on this project and started working away. Teddy Roosevelt, again, portrait photography. So Curtis had earlier won with Princess Angeline that we had seen. He already won national photographic contests, but in 1904, he won Prettiest Child in America in the Ladies' Home contest in the Ladies' Home Journal. So he wins the Prettiest Child in America. Teddy learns about this because he already knew about Mount Rainier and invites him out to the summer home. So Curtis lived with Teddy in their summer home to meet the family, to meet the children. The next year, Teddy invites him back for his inauguration. That's where Curtis meets Geronimo and takes an amazing photograph. The next year, he's invited to Roosevelt's daughter's wedding to be the photographer for the wedding. So he's very thick with Roosevelt. And this photograph of Roosevelt tells you a little bit about his photographic ability. So you can imagine Teddy Roosevelt straight on picture like we might take with a digital camera. But instead, what he does, he has the light coming from the side, a very serious look, dark on one side, light on the other. And Teddy thinks it's the best picture that was ever taken of him. And there were a lot of pictures taken of him. So this is Curtis at his photographic best.
Bob, I was thinking, I have one more question about the important people in Curtis' life. I understand there was a long relationship with J.P. Morgan as well. Can you tell us about that?
J.P. Morgan was extremely important in this story. Without J.P. Morgan, the story wouldn't be here. And what happened is that Curtis now, with his big project in mind, really didn't have the money. He was draining the funds from his Seattle studio, spent all his money, didn't have any, had to have money. And he asked Teddy Roosevelt to write a letter of introduction to J.P. Morgan so Curtis could get in to talk to him. And J.P. Morgan allowed him to come in. He was there for 5 minutes, and J.P. Morgan signaled to throw him out of the room, which wasn't unusual for J.P. Morgan. But Curtis was flipping through his photos and he flipped one more, a young maiden named Mosa Mojave. And Morgan stopped and agreed to fund the project. And from then on, J.P. Morgan and later his son thought this project was so important that they funded it. Unfortunately, Curtis didn't ask for a salary, so we'll later learn that he was broke his entire life, but working like crazy, and it was thanks to J.P. Morgan.
So Bob, which picture is this now that we have?
We're going to look at some pictures now that he did, because he's really most famous for his photography. And again, as a portrait photographer in Seattle, he worked hard to get the right lighting and everything, but he now wanted to capture the American Indians. So they were all being driven off to reservations, and his goal was to capture them really back in history before they were driven away. He wanted to see them at their best. He wanted to see them looking their best, doing their ceremonies, doing all the things. And so this is just one of the photographs. This is called Zuni Governor. And Zuni Governor is a powerful figure in the middle of Navajo land, which is where Hopis are tucked into the middle of Navajo land. And this just is one of the great examples of the kind of images he did of individuals. The other important thing is this is from the Rainier Club. Curtis donated this to the Rainier Club, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But these frames are original frames that are, again, created here in Seattle specifically for the Rainier Club, specifically for this picture. About it.
Well, Bob, here's another portrait by Curtis. Can you tell us a little bit about this one?
This is Goshoni, and there was an ongoing battle between Curtis and the Smithsonian. So he had been on the boat in Alaska with the folks from the Smithsonian. These are highbrow, East Coast, well-trained anthropologists, ethnologists, and they said that Curtis was wasting his time because the American Indians didn't have any religion, they didn't have any creation, they were just really people with no basis. And Curtis knew that wasn't true, and he didn't believe it, and he wanted to prove them wrong. So he came back to the Apaches, so Goshoni is an Apache, and he had been there before, knew the people, but came back and asked questions about the religion, and no one would talk to him, and the tribe was told not to speak to him. And a lot of this had already happened because the missionaries were there, and these people were told they'd be put in jail if they practiced any of their religious rites. But after a while, Curtis hung around and he hid in the bushes, and he saw Goshoni, the most powerful medicine man in the tribe, praying every morning. So he would hide in the bushes and would see him praying every morning. And after a while, he finally talked Goshoni into sharing the sacred deerskin with the paintings of their creation, their religion, everything that was important to them, and also agreeing to have his photo taken. Again, framed in a special frame here for the Rainier Club. The sad part of this was that a very few days after that, Goshoni was found dead, and the other medicine men had probably killed him.
Oh, for speaking out?
Yes.
Bob, what does this represent, the North American Indian?
This project that Curtis took on and that J.P. Morgan supported was the project of the North American Indian, which was going to be 20 volumes that we'll look at later, and 20 portfolios of large-size images that the people that purchased these would receive. And this is just the front page of portfolio number 10, which just gives you an example of what all the images and a little bit about them in that portfolio. So this is the introductory page to a portfolio.
So Bob, I understand that this is one of the pictures from the portfolio, and this is the actual size?
This is the actual size. So the portfolio front piece that we just looked at was actual size, and this is actual size. So along with the volumes that people purchased, they got these magnificent portfolios, and that now represents the images best known by the people collecting Curtis. This was in, well, it happened over a few years, but we'll basically say 1914. So Curtis was busy collecting images, languages, all of these things. But he also, remember, was this photographer who did all this experimental work in photography, silver prints, platinum prints. Most of the images here are platinum prints. This is a photogravure, which was a printing process. The gold tones or orotones we talked about earlier. Why not movies? So Curtis did the first feature-length full movie of American Indian. These were actually correctly First Nation Indians in Canada, a movie of a wedding, tribal disputes, the entire thing, and he shot this entire movie on scene, all Indian actors. So previous Indian movies out of Hollywood had Italians dressed up, but this was all shot on location with actual Indians. Was called In the Land of the Headhunters, opened in Seattle and New York in 1914 with a full orchestra playing. So this was a big show, Carnegie Hall, major studios, rave reviews, and then because of a fight with a distributor, it was taken off the market and disappeared for years. So this, in the movie industry, this is one of the most important movies ever shot because it is the history of movies.
Has it been found since then?
It has been found since then. It was rediscovered. Bill Holm from the Burke Museum. First of all, Burke was a president here at the Rainier Club, one of the founders of the Rainier Club in 1888. So he founded the Rainier Club, but also the Burke Museum is named after him. And, and Bill Holm, who became the first kind of curator at the Burke Museum, would go up to the Quack-Oodles and they would talk about the movie that their ancestors were in, and some of them were in, and he'd say, I've never seen it. And finally, Bill Holm at the Field Museum in Chicago learned that they had the footage. And in 1971, or 72, he found the movie and restored it. The music wasn't with it, so he actually had the Quack-Oodles make Indian music to go with it. And just recently a new book is written and a new movie is In Return to the Land of the Headhunter, in which case they found the original orchestra score down at UCLA with further footage at the Getty Museum, and now it has been fully restored with both of these restorations available for view.
Amazing. Bob, I understand you have one of the volumes here. What was the importance of the volume as far as Curtis' collection?
The project, the North American Indian, really was 20 volumes covering 80 tribes and 20 portfolios that we just talked about. And Curtis is so well known for his photography, but equally important were the information in the volumes where he tried to preserve their heritage and their knowledge. And so this is volume number 3, one of 20 volumes. And I just selected it to look at a couple of things. And I'm not sure how well you can see this. Take that white marker out if you would. But this is just an example of him preserving their languages. So he is putting the English language next to their language of multiple tribes. So he would preserve the language and he would have it here in the appendix. And many of these tribes, this was the last person to live that knew the language. So these only exist because of him. And
amazing.
The other thing that he did, so he talked about their religions and customs that we've talked a little bit about, but he also preserved their music and their songs. So another gigantic project of preserving all of this information. And this came because of the wax cylinders. So this trip he took to Alaska back in 1899, Harriman, the railroad man, had these new little things called wax cylinders where you could record sound for his children to play with. And Curtis identified those and said, ooh, I could use those. And he has done over 10,000 wax cylinders to preserve their language and song, and those then are preserved in these volumes. So this is just one of 20 volumes.
Amazing. And here we have another portrait. Could you tell us about this one?
This is Curtis in 1951. He's still looking pretty dapper. It's less than a year before he dies, but a lot had happened between 1914 that we last looked at and 1951. So he was broke. Things kept getting worse, more difficult for him. Clara, his poor wife, who was home raising the children, without a penny, trying to run the studio, but he was taking the studio money to do this Indian project. And in 1916, Clara filed for divorce, which was extremely public. So it hit all the newspapers. It went on for 3 years. It was a brutal battle, a very sad time for Curtis and for poor Clara. And the children mostly sided with him, which made it even worse. So it was just an awful thing. And Curtis had no money, so he came to live here at the Rainier Club. And he had a room upstairs, was unable to pay. And I think it's probably the best thing that ever happened to the Rainier Club, because he couldn't pay. They received all these magnificent portraits that we've been looking at in these wonderful frames, and that's how he paid his rent and paid for his food and for his lodging. He then went on to move down to LA. He worked on some films down there, The Ten Commandments with Cecil B. DeMille, doing on-site shots, but didn't like it there at all. Was severely depressed, was hospitalized for 2 years for depression, and finally in 1922 he made a comeback, kind of brought himself up again, and managed to then finish the entire project. So he finished the rest of the volumes, the rest of the portfolios, completed it in 1930. It was supposed to be completed in 5 years. It took him 30 years, and he completed the project in 1930, right in the middle of the Great Depression, at which point no one had any money, so he couldn't sell anything, and no one cared about the American Indians, and the project basically disappeared and was sold for $1,000, all of the volumes and the images, to a books collector who had a bookstore in Boston, Laureate, who put them in his basement. And in 1972, these were found, reemerged, and they've been reemerging ever since.
Bob, we've been looking at a lot of portraits. This image seems to be completely different, and not just because of its size, but it's a completely different kind of image. What is this one?
This is one of his more famous images, and it's called Canyon de Chelly is the name. Again, here at the Rainier Club with the original frame, which is magnificent, but this is significant. This is what Curtis really wanted. He wanted to capture the Indians of the past in their glory, and here they are, 7 on horses, going through this fantastic canyon with these high stones, and this is photography around 1900 with old cameras, but look at the depth of field that he captured. And the important thing is, while in the Canyon de Chelly, he talked his whole family into coming. So Curtis's family, wife, children, all came to the Canyon de Chelly to experience this, and all of a sudden, everything went silent. And Curtis learned that there was a mother trying to have a baby, and things were not going well. And someone came to his camp quickly, said, "You have to get out of here immediately or your whole family will be killed." And they packed everything up and left that night and got out. And fortunately found out a few days later that both the mother and the baby were okay, but if they hadn't been okay, Curtis and his family would have been finished. So this is both Curtis's effort to capture the Indians in their native environment, but also had a backstory of what might happen to Curtis's family if they didn't quickly leave the land.
There's a lot of interaction in between Curtis and the native people, that they always felt that there was a relationship or an effect of Curtis being there. And I've heard that they were concerned about taking an image that you could take the soul of the person. Did Curtis ever run into that with these?
There was concern about that, and there continues to be a lot of discussion about that. One thing, when he was on the Harriman expedition in Alaska, he was really terrified or really disappointed that they were stealing all these things from the Indians, artifacts, totem poles, everything. So he always paid to take their image. So he had agreement from the Indians and would pay them for that, for their image, and they would agree to have the image taken. But still, there's a lot of controversy that continues on.